Hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream of History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Mark and Mattison, and today we're discussing his book that just recently came out called Overcoming Personal Demons, a new translation of the Tchacos Codex. So, welcome back to the show, Mark. It's good to have you back on.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And also, I want to say thank you for inviting me to give a blurb to your book. This is the first time I've ever done that. This is what I wrote. It's right there in the back. But yeah, let's get started with the first text you talk about in the book, the letter of Peter to Philip. Can you tell us about what is that text for anyone that hasn't heard of it?
Well, it's an interesting text because it is framed as a letter, although after the introductory paragraph, the role of Philip drops completely out of view, and it's really Peter and the apostles, but principally Peter, who is who is featured in the text, and it mainly relates to a vision of the risen Jesus, and really gets to the heart of what many people were concerned about, many followers of Jesus at that time, with their fears, their concerns, their anxieties about persecution, about martyrdom. That Jesus suffered. What about us? What are we going to do? There are people out there who are, hostile toward us. How do we deal with that? And Jesus, of course, as we would expect, provides additional teaching and revelation and instructions about how to go out and preach the gospel of salvation.
And when do you think that text was written?
Well, the Tchacos Codex, to begin with, was written in Egypt in the 4th century, but the texts that it translates were written earlier in Greek. Most likely, the text was originally written in the 2nd century. And interestingly, we actually have two different versions of this text. One is in the Tchacos Codex, and the other we knew already from the Nag Hammadi library. But there are areas where the text is fragmentary in Nag Hammadi. So we've had that version for many years. Now that the Tchacos Codex has surfaced and been translated, we now have access to a synoptic version, a parallel version that is a little bit different and it can be used to fill in some of the gaps of the one in Nag Hammadi and vice versa.
And so, what century does that text, that codex, that codex dates?
The codex itself was composed in about approximately the 4th century of this Common Era, and it was written in Coptic, which is the last iteration of the Egyptian language, written primarily in Greek letters, with half a dozen other characters thrown in for sounds that Egyptian had that Greek did not have. So this was a text written in very early in the church's history.
So now I'd like to move on to James, the second tractate in the Codex.
Yes, this is a fascinating text. Here is known only as James, but in the Nag Hammadi library, another version of this text is recorded as the first apocalypse or the first revelation of James. Just thinking about Nag Hammadi for a moment, in the Nag Hammadi Codex, there are actually two different tractates called the Apocalypse of James, and they're side by side. So scholars, to differentiate them, have described the first one in the Nag Hammadi Codex as the first Apocalypse of James, and the second as the second Apocalypse of James. So we actually have two different versions of the first Apocalypse of James. Again, in the Tchacos Codex, it's named only James. But a third fragmentary text was uncovered just a few years ago from the Oxyrhynchus papyri that is these Greek fragments of the same text that were identified that interestingly not only add to our body of knowledge about the text and additional manuscripts that we can look to, but interestingly, the Greek text is closer to the Tchacos Codex than it is to the Nag Hammadi Codex. But we have three different versions of James now, and in my book, I included in the text, the one in the Tchacos Codex, but in the footnotes and in the back matter, I pulled in insights and variant texts from the other versions of the first Apocalypse of James.
What are those two apocalypses of James about? What do they tell us about James?
Well, I'm not sure precisely what you mean. If you're asking about the historical James, I'm not sure.
Well, let me rephrase. The James that it's telling us about.
Okay, the James is telling us about. Well, for one thing, talking about historicity, there is some interesting convergence between the description of James's martyrdom by stoning in both these texts and in Eusebius and in Josephus, interestingly. But the second Apocalypse of James focuses on James as a salvific figure, almost someone who is depicted as the brother of Jesus and as an actual illuminator or redeemer himself. In the first Apocalypse of James, James is portrayed as the successor of Jesus. At one point, the disciples are talking amongst themselves and talking about James as their second teacher. The first, of course, being Jesus, James being his successor, which corroborates the Gospel of Thomas that talks about, in which Jesus says, you'll look to James after I'm gone, for whom heaven and earth came into being. So James is Jesus's successor. And interestingly, in the first Apocalypse of James, despite its being oftentimes associated with quote unquote Gnostic forms of Christianity, there's actually a lot of interest in the Jewish history, especially in the portion of the text near the end of it that talks about the transmission of the revelation from Jesus to James, then to Maniel or Masvel, then to someone named Levi and Levi's younger son. And the chronology of this transmission goes all the way from just prior to the fall of Jerusalem in the war, in the Roman War of approximately 70 or 66 through 70 on the one hand, and then even going through the Kaitos rebellion of 115 to 117 CE, and then even to the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135. So these historical events are narrated in the text, and as well as a history of transmission that goes through that same timeline. And I have a chart in the book that outlines all of that. But it's fascinating because it shows a particular and a great interest in the national history of Israel. And it also supports an original 2nd century date for the Greek text, because it only goes up about through the Bar Kokhba revolt around the 130s. And it pretty much stops there, which is a pretty good guess for, kind of like a kind of the approximate dating of the text.
Now, what is the Gospel of Judas?
So the Gospel of Judas, of course, is is probably the most well-known of these texts and the most famous or infamous, depending on how you want to put it. And this is the text that was featured prominently in the title and in the media splash created by National Geographic when the Tchacos Codex was first announced to the public and published in 2006. National Geographic actually waited until they had their television program on the Gospel of Judas, their documentary, ready to roll as they announced the publication of this text. So the Gospel of Judas was the one that they most prominently featured because of its obviously more, I guess, sensational or potential sensational value. But the Gospel of Judas is a text, and it's a lot more nuanced than it was originally depicted, in part because of the rush for a lot of media coverage that depicted Judas as the hero of the text, working with Jesus to coordinate his being captured and executed by the Roman authorities, someone who was working with Jesus and doing what he wanted him to do, the hero of the story, if you will. He was initially portrayed that way by National Geographic before much peer review could be performed with respect to this text. As scholars got a closer look at the text after its publication, there should have been peer review beforehand, but that's another story. At any rate, scholars began to notice a much more nuanced understanding of Judas, who in the text is actually a doubly tragic figure. He may be someone who has a more spiritual insight than the remainder of Jesus's disciples, yet even he will not inherit the kingdom. And Jesus is revealing these secrets and this message of judgment to Judas so that he can better prepare for his role of betraying Jesus for money to the authorities at the end of the book. The Gospel of Judas, like many of these texts, is actually an apocalyptic text. It draws a lot from Jewish apocalypticism in its description of the coming judgment, but it's been refracted through a Christian lens that has some very negative portrayals of Judaism as well. But that's essentially what the Gospel of Judas is.
Now, what about the Book of the Stranger?
That is one of my favorites, actually, the Book of the Stranger, or the Foreigner, or Allogenes, which is the Greek term. And this is actually the text that I was originally most interested in with respect to the Tchacos Codex, especially because there is a passage on pages 63 to 66 of the Codex that closely parallels the Gospel of Mary, pages 10 through 15, if I remember correctly. I'm sorry, 15 through 17, I think it is. So I was particularly interested in Allogenes because of its relationship to the Gospel of Mary and the question of what that relationship is, whether one text is dependent upon the other or whether both go back to an earlier verlage. But the Book of Allogenes is a very short text. There are a number of missing pages. We don't know how many pages are missing, but there are, we have I think pages like 61 through 66, and then an unknown number of pages missing, and then finally a fragmentary conclusion to the text. But what is there is pretty fascinating. It's different than the Book of Allogenes in the Nag Hammadi Library, which is much longer and relates a series of visions given to the Allogenes character as he ascends through the various heavens in his visionary ascent. But in this Book of Allogenes, it starts off with Allogenes and a disciple going up to Mount Tabor, which is the traditional site of the Transfiguration, praying for an understanding of where they've come from, where they're going, and how they get there, those kinds of things. And then the stranger has this revelation. First, he is tempted by the devil. That obviously is influenced by the story, the narrative of the temptation of Jesus in Matthew 4 and Luke 4. Then stranger experiences a transfiguration, which also is heavily informed by the New Testament Gospels. And finally, the revelation is given to stranger about the various malevolent powers which will be overcome by the soul as he ascends to the Father. And that is the portion of text that is very, very parallel to the Gospel of Mary, that narrates the ascent of a soul through various powers. And I was going to say something else about that, but I forgot what it was. So maybe it will come to me. Oh, I recall now. So another fascinating thing about this is that when National Geographic first published their translation in 2006, with the critical edition following in 2007, there were several fragments of the text that had not yet been obtained. But 3 years later, or in 2010, there were additional fragments recovered from an irresponsible antiquities dealer from Ohio. And these fragments were going to be reunited with the manuscript in Europe. But the manuscript was intercepted at the airport, and it was repatriated to Egypt. Fortunately, photographs were taken of the fragments before their repatriation, and the fragments of pages 63 through 66 were only later published. They were not in the National Geographic's original translation, but all of those fragments are in this translation, as well as a fragment that was subsequently discovered in Pennsylvania, I believe, at a university where it had been donated by someone for a tax write-off, probably obtained from that same irresponsible antiquities dealer.
So can you tell us about the Corpus Hermeticum 13 on rebirth?
Absolutely, and this is a fascinating one because this text is literally a pagan text. It's not even a Christian text. So one might ask, well, what is a pagan text doing in the Tchacos Codex? But then one remembers that among the early Christians, Hermes Trismegistus was widely regarded as a pagan prophet of the coming of Christianity, and therefore highly regarded among many of Jesus's early followers. And one looks also at the particular choice, to select this particular portion of the Corpus Hermeticum. One sees that a number of thematic similarities to the remainder of the tractates in the Tchacos Codex. For one thing, it takes place on a mountain, and mountains feature prominently throughout the Codex. There's a mountain in each one of them, really, whether it be Golgotha or Golgol, or there are textual variants in the letter of Peter to Philip, or whether it be the Mount of Olives in Philip, Golgol in James, water on the exalted mountain in the Gospel of Judas, and Mount Tabor in the book of the Stranger. And then there's there's Sermon on the Mount in this particular Corpus Hermeticum fragment, or fragments as well. And another point of commonality is the focus of that tractate, which is, although very little of it is preserved in the Tchacos Codex, we know of it from other sources, and we know that it's all about rebirth. That one can't see God unless one can't be saved unless one is first reborn, and that's a theme that we find, for example, also in the Gospel of Judas. So looking for the commonalities between the tractates and the Codex is really key to working at what the scribe may have been aiming for as that scribe composed this Codex.
What kind of complications existed in the studies of the Tchacos Codex due to its connection to Gnosticism?
Wow, there are a lot of there are many things that could be said about that, but it's a fascinating text, and the history about it is equally fascinating. And one might spend as much time talking about the history of the Tchacos Codex and its interpretation as one might about the actual contents of the manuscript. But like the Nag Hammadi codices that were discovered in Egypt in 1945, the Tchacos Codex, which was discovered in the 1970s, also had a long and roundabout journey until its final publication in 2006. Again, trading hands many times, often with antiquities dealers trying to earn more money than what was reasonably possible. by selling it to institutions. At one point, a collector in Europe, whose last name was Tchacos, which is why it's called the Tchacos Codex, purchased it, and at one point tried to sell it through Bruce Farini, the irresponsible antiquities dealer I mentioned earlier in the United States. And what Farini was going to do was flip the manuscript so that he could, pay for it after he had received his money. But the deal fell through. So when Tchacos demanded to have the manuscript back because he couldn't sell it, he returned it, but not all of it. He kept behind some fragments that he was selling on the side, and so that was a very disturbing element there. So it took a while for these other fragments to come to light, and it only came to light in a bankruptcy proceeding before he died. But the history of the recovery of the text is quite interesting, but the interpretation also. Now, here's another unfortunate thing is how the publication of the text was handled. National Geographic essentially wanted a scoop, so they had all the top scholars that they assembled to work on this text sign non-disclosure agreements, so their work was not subject to widespread peer review before its publication. And they were working on translating and commenting on the text as it was being reconstructed. The first generation of scholars who are working on this text, who, don't get me wrong, are fabulous scholars and very esteemed in their own right, and did do a very good job. Nevertheless, they were working to a certain extent out of a presumption that Irenaeus's description of the Gospel of Judas, circa 180 CE, was an accurate portrayal of Judas being a protagonist of the text. This is interesting too, because unlike other Gospels, like the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Luke, and so forth, where the preposition is always kata, according to. In the case of Judas, it's not actually the gospel according to Judas. It's the gospel. The preposition in Coptic is actually the preposition for the word of. It's the gospel of Judas, which is more ambiguous or ambivalent. It could be the gospel more about Judas, more so than the gospel presenting Judas's point of view per se, which I think is significant. But it's apparent when one watches the National Geographic documentary and some of his earlier media accounts that this text was being paraded as a potential answer to the problem of anti-Semitism, because and you get that when you read Bart Ehrman's book about the Gospel of Judas, because Judas is widely regarded as a tragic figure, and as history goes on, and Ehrman actually does a really good job of describing the how, with the passage of time, with each new iteration of the Christian depiction of Judas throughout history, Judas becomes more and more despicable. And the word Judas literally means Jew, and so the Judas was seen. The vilification of Judas is seen then as a type of anti-Semitism, and by reclaiming or vindicating the figure of Judas, the hope was that this would provide a plank against anti-Semitism. That's ironic, because not only does the Gospel of Judas not really vindicate Judas from being a traitor, but it also has some very anti-Semitic components. For instance, the sacrificial system is criticized, as well as the God of Israel, who is essentially the demiurge, whom Jesus' disciples are falsely following. So there are clearly anti-Semitic elements to the Gospel of Judas. Again, as I mentioned earlier, although it has roots in Jewish apocalypticism, those components have been refracted through an early Christian lens with an anti-Semitic component. But when one asks about whether this is a collection of Gnostic works, that presents challenges of its own. Because if we look at what people describe as the different quote-unquote types of Gnosticism, scholars categorize different schools of quote-unquote Gnostic thought, including Sethian Gnosticism and Valentinian Gnosticism, for example. And the texts that have been collected in the anthology of this codex represent more than one type of these types of texts. For example, James, or the first apocalypse of James, is sometimes identified as a Valentinian text. Allegonaeus looks more like a Sethian text, and or as is the Gospel of Judas. So then we have like so-called Sethian and Valentinian texts together, as well as that pagan text in the Corpus Hermeticum. So when you have such widely divergent types of literature, or what people have described as different types of literature, pulled together in the same volume, that raises questions. What kind of hodgepodge is this anthology? On the other hand, if one looks at it from the perspective of the scribe and the scribe's monastic community in 4th century Egypt, not even necessarily the meaning that these texts may have had in earlier Greek iterations, but when one looks at the Coptic text as we have it from the 4th century, then one can start to ask questions like, what may have been driving the scribe? Because the scribe obviously selected these 5 texts among many other texts. There were other texts that could have been included, but these are the 5 that were selected. And not only were they selected, but they were placed in a certain order. So then one looks at that and says, well, okay, what kind of overarching meta-narrative does this codex provide when it pulls these texts together and places them side by side? And then we can look through for the commonalities, which is essentially what I did in this book and what other scholars have done before me. And one can see a number of themes emerging, one of them being the common teaching about a demiurge creating the material world, but also of the anxieties of early Christians, afraid for their well-being, afraid of persecution and suffering and death, and the subsequent comforting of them by revelation from Jesus about their future salvation, as well as instructions about ascending past these various malevolent powers on their way as they return back to God. Hence the name of the book that I've selected, Overcoming Personal Demons, because it's literally a matter of overcoming demons, not only in the ascent of a soul in the afterlife, but even in this worldly sense, in a metaphorical sense, one might say, because these demons often, as in Allegonaeus, are given very relatable names like ignorance and fear, and death. These fears that are, very very real challenges that people of faith face. And so we might ask the question, well, what did this text say to the 4th century Christians who originally read the text and used it in their community life? And what might it even say for people today who are reading the text? And that's kind of getting to the nuts and bolts and the bottom of what this text is really all about, which is about remembering who we are, where we come from, that we are that we're divine children of God, and we'll be returning to God, and that's a message, and to take comfort in that, and that's a message that can be broadly appreciated even across religious lines.
Why do you think that this text, the Tchacos Codex, has faced so many issues in trying to get out there in general? Like, in your view, like, how do you take it all in? Like, what do you think happened?
You mean in recent years, or in the 4th century, or what do you mean precisely? I'm sorry.
why it was so difficult to get it out there to the public in general.
Oh, so I think you're asking about the fact that it took so long for it to become published. Yes. Okay. Perfect. And you can read more about that in my book on the Gospel of Judas, as well as in National Geographic's copy, and a few other books that are out there as well that go into more detail about the history of the text itself. And the main reason was greed. It was antiquities dealers who were trying to make a lot of money off of the text. At one point, representatives from the University of Michigan were invited to have a look at it, and they could have spent, they had the authority to spend several tens of thousands of dollars for it, but not the $1 million that the dealer was asking for it. So the fact that people were trying to make money off of it, that was the main reason that it took so long for it to be turned over to a responsible institution that worked on the meticulous restoration of the manuscript, and also with the presentation of it. So that's the main challenge there. That covers a period of about 30 years, up until about the year 2000, when it was finally turned over to a responsible agency.
What do you think all these texts shed light on?
Again, I think that when one looks at the themes that emerge, throughout the text, that likely stood out to the scribe that selected them, one appreciates the main questions that the scribe and the scribe's community were grappling with. And these questions actually occur in multiple tractates throughout this codex. Very basic questions that are questions that people have asked for thousands of years. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How do we get there? And very importantly, what is suffering? Where does suffering come from? Why do we suffer as we do? Which is the problem of evil, or in theology we call it the issue of theodicy, from theos meaning God, and dike meaning righteousness. So it's a matter of quote unquote defending the righteousness of God. Essentially, how can a good God allow bad things to happen in the world? And one of the ways the Tchacos Codex deals with this problem, as well as many other people from this time period, was to describe evil and deficiency as arising out of an emanation lower down the divine scale than that of the eternal, indescribable, unnameable, unimaginable divine God. So the depiction of a creator God or a demiurge who crafts a material world and imprisons divine souls in these physical bodies that suffer, when the authorities and the rulers and the powers that be, trying to keep these souls down and needing to be overcome in the ascent of the faithful back to God. Not only in this life, in seeking spiritual means to overcome the challenges of ignorance and fear and anxiety, but also to look forward to an afterlife. Those are essentially the concerns that one finds addressed by the text. Now, whether this answer to the problem of evil is an answer that really works is another question. I mean, obviously, it's another variation on the theme. A lot of people may say, well, goodness comes from God and evil comes from the devil, so God isn't responsible for the evil that comes from the devil. For example, that's what many Christians say. But the obvious follow-up question is, okay, well, why does God, if that is so, then why does God allow the devil to perpetuate this evil when clearly God should have the power to stop it? Hence the old Epicurean riddle, is God all powerful, but, I forget the exact wording of the riddle. I'd have to Google it. But God says, the question is God all powerful, but and if he's all powerful, then why does evil exist? Is he not all powerful? Is he all good but not all powerful? Well, then how can God be that great? So in terms of logic, I'm not sure there really is an adequate philosophical answer to the problem of suffering. I think it should be more of a pastoral question than a theological question. But nevertheless, that essentially is the tack that the Tchacos Codex takes to explain the origin of evil and suffering, that it doesn't come from God, but it comes from a lower realm, a physical realm in which suffering is a part, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm going to read what I wrote for the blurb, and then we'll close. From Gnostic texts, apocryphal gospels, and lost gospels, Mark Mattison delivers on providing the attention that these Christian writings deserve to receive. Even though some do discuss them, it is my opinion that there is not enough weight given to them, for they reveal the diverse views of several distinct Christian groups, views that they had on Judas, James, Peter, Thomas, Mary, and Philip, among others. A reader who wishes to know more about these ancient denominations of Christians should pick up this book to get started. And again, the link to purchase the book is in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. And that being said, thank you for joining me today, Mark.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.